Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Len. Thanks for watching. This is a long one, so you might want to crank her up to 2x and just let her fly. So go ahead, like, subscribe, share, and we'll see you on the next one. I want to talk about Weimar. Want to talk about hyperinflation and the truth about history's most infamous hyperinflation horror story. We talk about this, we refer to the Weimar Republic all the time as stackers. It's kind of our worst fear, our worst case scenario, our SHTF, right? So let's talk about Weimar Republic and what happened there and see what we can learn from it. After World War I, Weimar went through one of the worst hyperinflation situations in history, and it unleashed horror on the German people and the German economy. And to this day, we as stackers and many people will invoke Weimar Republic as the ultimate hyperinflation horror story. Critics of the Federal Reserve's extraordinary attempts to stimulate the economy since 2008 and up to the present pandemic, like the program of large-scale bond purchases known as quantitative easing or QE, have warned that the U.S.'s central bank's easy money policies are dangerous and would eventually stoke unwanted inflation. And what are we seeing right now, guys? Ever since earlier this year, when the Fed hinted it could move to begin rolling back quantitative easing or tapering, inflation premiums have collapsed as real estate rates have soared. Gold, for example, which we all recognize as an inflation hedge, or silver, crashed just last weekend. A little flash crash, but a crash nonetheless. Adam Ferguson wrote the definitive book on Weimar, a real instance of hyperinflation, titled When Money Dies. It used to be out of print and a bit hard to find, but now you can find it entirely online. And here I'm going to summarize some of the key elements of Ferguson's book. Okay. It may have been true, there is no reason to doubt it, that a short, sharp war and a speedy victory in 1914 had been both hoped for and expected, together with the prospect of eventual war indemnities extorted from the Entente. This would possibly have justified taking temporary liberties, even outrageous ones, with the known laws of finance. The known laws of finance. That was indeed how it did begin. In part, the natural result of having a self-willed army itching for war and a federal parliament which, though with limited power over the country's constituent states, still had to find the money to pay for it. Furthermore, it censored information heavily. Quote from the book here: every German stock exchange was closed for the duration, so that the effect of Reichsbank's policies on stocks and shares was unknown. Further, foreign exchange rates were not published, and only those in contact with neutral markets such as Amsterdam or Zurich could even guess what was going on. Only when the war was over, with the veil of censorship lifted but the Allied blockade continuing, did it become clear to all with eyes to read that Germany had already met an economic disaster nearly as shattering as her military one. With the benefits of 2 years' hindsight, the I don't speak German here, so I'm going to butcher this. The Vossische Zeitung could print in August of 1921, quote, our military defeat was due to the fact that for every 1,000 men we had in the trenches, double that number of deserters and embusques remained at home. These deserters were activated less by military than by economic motives. The rise in prices was mainly responsible for the poverty of families of the enlisted men. Not only did the Treaty of Versailles impose reparation demands that Germany would never realistically be able to repay, but it also annexed German territory and required the army to fire hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Quote, the implications of these truncations for the German economy were of course enormous, and so were those of the requirements to reduce the German army to a quarter of its size, for it meant that over 250,000 more disbanded soldiers were to be thrown onto the labor market. Work had to be found for them at any cost, or so it was calculated. What spelt doom were the clauses that made Germany responsible for the war and demanded colossal reparations, in money and in kind, to meet the Allies' costs. In the aftermath, the German political scene was wildly volatile and assassinations were rampant. The right-wing and left-wing parties that emerged from the wreckage of the war were starkly opposed to each other, and it divided the country. Quote, some of the poison of northern militarism having, as it were, been drawn off, the disaffected reactionary elements the reactionary elements mainly took refuge in the hotbeds of the South. Bavaria then became the mainspring of Germany's 400 political murders, mostly unpunished, many unsolved, between 1919 and 1923. The militarist right may not have been responsible for more than the lion's share of them, but those early years were certainly open to public. Let me completely reread that sentence. The militarist right may not have been responsible for more than the lion's share of them, but those years were certainly an open season for the officials and supporters of the new republic. By September of 1920, prices were 12 times as high as they had been before the war, and by autumn of 1920, the strains on the economy in the wake of the war were apparent, but employment was still pretty strong. Quote, food had accounted for half of the family budget then, but now nearly 3/4 of any family's income went into food. The food for a family of 4 persons, which cost 60 marks in a week in April of 1919, cost 198 marks by September of 1920, and 230 marks by November of 1920. Certain items such as lard, ham, tea, and eggs rose to between 30 and 40 times the pre-war price. On the bright side, in contrast to Austria, the unofficial unemployment figure was low. Only 375,000 people were on the dole. In March of 1921, France occupied German ports because they couldn't make reparation payments. Lord d'Albernone, the British ambassador to Berlin, warned the Allies that Germany would not be able to repay. But France insisted and then occupied German ports. Quote from the book, it was at the Paris conference at the end of January of 1921 where France herself, not far from insolvency, began making demands on Germany, which d'Albernone described as quite simply as amazing. The figures that came out of Paris for German considerations, although nowhere near what the French had demanded, provoked shock in Germany by March. France lost patience with the Germans, and by the way of sanctions under the peace treaty, the Rhine ports of Duisburg, Ruhrort, and Dusseldorf were occupied by the Allies. Meanwhile, amid the economy gloom and the lower and middle classes to the rich spending money like crazy, to avoid high taxes, the rich instead spent as much money as they could. However, it highlighted the class divide in Germany, where lower income earners were having trouble getting by. Quote, the extravagance of the rich... let me start that over. I had to swallow there. The extravagance of the rich one hears of is very sad, but it is said to be largely due to high taxation, as they feel that unless they spend it, the government is going to get most of it. Unfortunately, the person from whom it is most difficult to collect taxes are those who should pay the most. That is to say, war profiteers and particularly traders in contraband goods, who in many cases have not kept accounts. In August of 1921, a major political assassination sent the German market plunging. Matthias Erzberger, a socialist leader who was a big proponent of taxation, was assassinated in August of 1921. The murder of Erzberger undermined any remaining confidence that the German economy might be allowed to recover its health. Bankers from Switzerland, Italy, and Germany soberly concluded that it was impossible for Germany to continue her payments to the Entente and that sooner or later she would have to declare herself bankrupt, followed, they thought, by first France and then by Italy. The mark at 310 to the pound in mid-August had sped downwards to over 400 by mid-September and was still going down. Meanwhile, anyone who could get their hands on foreign currency was selling their marks. Germans everywhere were doing everything they could to convert their marks into other currencies. A counselor at the British Embassy in Berlin wrote, and I quote, "Millions of persons in this country are, I think accurately, reported to be buying foreign currencies in anticipation of fresh tax burdens and to be hoarding foreign banknotes. I hardly know a single German of either sex who is not speculating in foreign currencies, such as Austrian crowns, Polish marks, and even Kerensky rubles. Inasmuch also as a fall of the value of the mark is inevitably accompanied by a rise in the quotation of industrial shares, speculators are supposed to be operating systematically to depreciate the mark with a view to reaping the benefit of higher quotations in the market share," unquote. As February of 1922 approached, it became clear that Germany wouldn't be able to make its reparation payment. In the inevitable event that Germany was not able to make good on the reparations to the Allies by the end of February of 1922, France would occupy a major economic region of Germany. Quote, Germany now needed to find 500 million gold marks before the end of February to pay the Allies, and knew that she faced sanctions by France, the occupation of Rur in case of default. Default would come unless London helped. The London bankers, however, refused to give the necessary credits unless Germany put her financial house in order and unless French demands became more reasonable, since no condition could apparently be met without the fulfillment of the others of its preconditions. German bankers now began to fear that the mark might fall to Austrian levels. Meanwhile, goods were flying off the shelves of shops as people tried to protect themselves against the falling values of the currencies. The scene described by Addison in Berlin shops in November of 1921 was chaotic. Quote, "Many shops declared themselves to be sold out. Others closed from 1 to 4 in the afternoon, and most of them refused to sell more than one article of the same kind to each customer. The rush to buy is now practically over, as prices on the whole have been raised to meet the new level of exchange. In almost every camera shop, however, the sight of Japanese eagerly purchasing is still a common feature. But on the whole, as far as Berlin is concerned, it is the Germans themselves who are doing the most of the retail buying and laying in stores for fear of further rises in prices and total depletion of stocks." However, a conference of Allied powers over reparations in December of 1921 offered Germany a glimmer of hope. It appeared at a conference in December that the Allied powers finally were realizing that holding Germany to the following year's reparation payments were unrealistic. This led to a surge in the mark. Quote, This consideration sent a wave of confidence crashing dangerously back through the exchanges, confidence that at last the intolerable blight of the financial system would be removed. On December 1st, 1921, the mark soars upwards, regaining a quarter of its November value. By the time it reached $7.51 to the pound against its November average of $1,041, the paper mark prices of many stocks and shares, although still well above the levels of December of 1920, had declined by half or more, while the Reichsbank was buying foreign currencies heavily. But regardless of the politics, by Christmas of 1921, ordinary Germans were feeling the squeeze of inflation. By the end of 1921, workers had lost so much faith in the government that many just stopped voting. The economic hardships brought about by inflation were evident in everyday prices. Quote, in the 18 years since 1913, the price of rye bread had risen by 13 times, beef by 17 times. Those were the commodities which had fared best. Sugar, milk, at $4.4 marks a liter, pork and even potatoes at 1.5 marks a pound had risen between 23 and 28 times. Butter was up 33 times. These were only the official prices. Real prices were often a third higher, and all these prices were roughly half as much again as in October only 2 months before. The relative strength of the mark in 1921 foreshadowed what would come years later when the hyperinflation was finally stopped. When the mark was strong, companies went bankrupt as share prices plummeted. Thus, an inverse correlation was established. Quote, the 1921 figures were the most indicative, for in comparing the number of bankruptcies during the various months of the year, it could be shown that a falling mark was associated with a decline in bankruptcies and vice versa. The largest number, 845, was in the spring when the mark stood highest, but after it reached its lowest, November, the number was 150. The Frankfurter Zeitung commented, it gives some inkling of the awful debacle which may be expected if a rapid and permanent improvement of the mark actually takes place. The relationship between the strong mark and increased bankruptcies also highlighted class tension. Owners of large industrial conglomerates benefited from the inflation, so they constantly reminded the populace that amid the economic chaos, employment was still very high. Quote, Hugo Steins himself, the richest and most powerful industrialist in Germany, whose empire was over 1/6 of the country's industry, had been largely built on the advantageous foundation of an inflationary economy, paraded a social conscience shamelessly. He justified inflation as the means of guaranteed full employment, not as something desirable, but simply as the only course open to a benevolent government. It was, he maintained, the only way whereby the life of the people could be sustained. In summer of 1922, the small businessman saw his enemy as in the big businessman, personified by Herr Steins. The greatest obstacle to currency reform, as Lord d'Aubrion described him. Then, in June of 1922, the German foreign minister who was in favor of paying reparations was assassinated. Walter Rathaus was a German foreign minister, and he was often linked to the unpopular stance that Germany should find a way to pay its reparations. He was now trusted by the right-wingers in government. Rathaus, this is a quote from the book, Rathaus, a Jew like Erzberger, who had just undergone, like Erzberger, a vitriolic attack in the Reichstag from the rightist leader, Dr. Helfferich. A few hours later, as Rathaus was driven from his home to the Foreign Office, the path of his car was blocked deliberately by another, while 2 assassins in a third car which had been following riddled him with bullets at close range. A bomb thrown into his car for good measure nearly cut his body in two. This further worried the international community as the mark plunged on the news. Anti-Semitism in Germany was on the rise, and anti-Semitism in Germany was rising in general. The consul in Frankfurt, Germany, describing a disturbing trend on the rise of anti-Semitism in 1922, said this: "It is no exaggeration to say that cultured German men and women of high social standing openly advocate the political murder of Jews as a legitimate weapon of defense. They admit it is true that the murder of Rathaus was of doubtful advantage, but they say there are no others who must go so that Germany shall be saved. Even if Frankfurt, with a preponderating Jewish population, the movement is so strong that the Jews of social standing are being asked to resign their appointments on the boards of companies." In July, even the workers who printed new money went on strike, which led to crisis. A confidential memorandum prepared for the Chancellor of Germany regarding the incident indicated suspicion that someone behind the scenes was trying to impede the government's ability to print money. Quote, "An extraordinary amount of paper money had been needed in June, causing the Reichsbank to issue 11,300 million marks in new notes. Owing to strikes, the usual inflow of these notes back into the bank had not happened, so that there were none in reserve. In spite of the readiness of the trade unions to go ahead with the new paper, the printers themselves suddenly withdrew their consent. It was plain," said the memorandum, "that other forces were at work than merely a wage or sympathy strike. It seemed improbable that hidden and illicit leaders were trying to seize the state by throat." Then, in the middle of the crisis, the German government took an inopportune holiday which sent the mark plunging again. In a strange move, the German government decided to go on holiday, and it destroyed the confidence and exacerbated the crisis. Quote, At what might otherwise have been the height of the immediate crisis at the end of July of 1922, the Reparations Commission decided to take its summer holidays, effectively postponing any settlement on the exchange of turmoil until mid-August, and French Prime Minister M. Poincaré, bent as ever, it was believed, on Germany's destruction, and sent a note to Berlin accusing the government of willful defraud on debts and threatening retortion. The effect on the financial situation was calamitous. The rise in prices intensified. The demand for currency, both by the state and other employers, much business quickly came to a standstill. The panic spread to the working class when they realized that their wages were simply not available. Meanwhile, working class wages were rising faster than inflation, which squeezed the middle class. The disadvantaged middle class was the class that maintained communication with the outside world, so foreigners' view of the domestic situation in Germany was especially downbeat. Since these were fixed according to the average rate paid to a chauffeur's class worker, the chauffeur was not suffering unduly except insofar as wage rises. A monthly occurrence by this time always lagged a little behind price rises, which took place weekly, if not daily. This was the case for the vast mass of artisans and workmen, but of course the middle class, including officials and journalists, were far from being in the same satisfactory position. It was from the latter group the foreigners mostly derived their information, which was why the accounts of the incidence of inflation, published broadly, were almost unrelievedly gloomy. However, by autumn of 1922, inflation started to outpace wages once again, and everyone felt the pain. Inflation was soaring by autumn of 1922, and the working class began to lose their edge. Quote, "Already, however, a new element had joined the the economic crisis. For the first time, the wages paid for labor began to lag behind the rise in prices, noticeably and seriously in spite of everything the monopoly of the unions could do about it. President Herbert, pleading to engineer a further moratorium on reparations, pointed out that the conditions of existence for the working population had become completely impossible and that the downfall of Germany's economic life was imminent. The mark was cheaper than wallpaper. Basic staples were becoming increasingly out of reach as the mark plunged, and German consumers lost an extraordinary amount of purchasing power. Quote, a liter of milk, which had cost 7 marks in April of 1922 and 16 in August, by mid-September cost 26 marks. Beer climbed from 5.6 marks per liter to 18 and then to 30. A single egg, 3.6 marks. In April, now cost 9 marks. In only 9 months, the bi-weekly bill for an identical food basket had risen from 370 marks to 2,615. The soaring inflation led to currency chaos as everyone began to issue their own forms of money. There was a major shortage of cash in spite of the German central bank's wild expansion of the money supply. As a result, employers began issuing IOUs to workers all over. Quote, large industrial concerns began to pay their workmen partly in notes and partly in coupons of their own, which were accepted by local tradesmen on the understanding that they would be redeemed within a very short time. Municipalities, too, started to issue their own currencies, aware that any delay in receiving their pay packets would dangerously aggravate workers whose main concern was to spend them before they depreciated, unquote. Then, in December, the French Prime Minister declared that France would occupy Germany the following month. Germany was clearly in no state to pay reparations, and France was angry. At a meeting in London, French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré made this declaration, quote, the meeting itself, a preliminary to another in Paris, met in December to consider whether a moratorium on reparations ought to be granted. It was remarkable not merely for the presence of Signor Mussolini representing Italy, but for M. Poincaré's firm announcement that Mr. Bonner Law had whatever happens, I shall advance into the Rur on January 15th. It was France, not Britain, and Sir Eric Geddes' famous phrase of 1918 was intent on getting everything out of Germany so that you can get out of a lemon and a bit more, determined to squeeze her until you can hear the pips squeak, unquote. In January, France followed through with its threat, further devastating the German economy. France occupied the Ruhr, Germany's coal and resource-rich industrial region, as a part of sanctions for not meeting reparation payments. German workers in the Ruhr resisted by striking. Quote, lacking an army big enough to take countermeasures, she riposted in the only way that came to mind, the policy of passive resistance in the newly occupied areas. The industrial heart of Germany practically stopped beating. Hardly anyone worked. Hardly anything ran. The German economy, however, called upon to subsidize an open-ended general strike, was not only denied its most important domestic products and raw materials, coal, coke, iron, and steel in particular, but was robbed of its former enormous foreign earnings from Rhine-Ruhr exports. The exchequer was itself deprived of all normal tax revenue from a huge portion of the nation's industry, as well as the coal tax and the income from the Ruhr railways, unquote. France's occupation of the Ruhr region sent the mark plummeting into real hyperinflation. Along with economic devastation, Germany's loss of the Ruhr was the straw that broke the camel's back for the mark. Quote, the Ruhr Basin was was in 1923 provided nearly 85% of Germany's remaining coal resources and 80% of her steel and pig iron productions, accounted for 70% of her traffic in goods and minerals, and contained 10% of her population. The loss of the Ruhr's production and all it implied was therefore a bale of last straws. At 35,000 to the pound in Christmas of 1922, the mark fell to 48,000 on the day after the invasion, and at the end of January of 1923 touched 227,500, well over 50,000 to the dollar, unquote. And by the summer of 1923, food shortages were hitting Germany hard. The domestic situation in Germany resulting from the French occupation led to a full-blown food emergency in August of 1923. Quote, on August of 1910, on which date a printer's strike broke out and the further interruption of the supply of banknotes, the full weight of the shortage of paper money was felt. Stocks of food disappeared entirely in many communities, and factories were able to pay wages on account only. The railway workers in the British zone within a wage tariff, half of the factory workers attempted to join the passive resistors of the Rur and asked pathetically whether, if they were not allowed to strike, they could at least be guaranteed by the occupation authorities enough food at fixed prices, as well as the money to buy it, unquote. By then, Germans were afraid that France might even invade the German capital. Complete and total gloom and fear of further conflict with France, which provided a backdrop that helped Hitler rise to power. Quote, despair indeed was consuming Germany. It was believed that the disturbances in the Ruhr and the Rhineland might lead to the French marching upon Berlin, and the French did not discourage such talk. Violent communist-led outbreaks were occurring in Saxony and Thuringia, and the reactionary movement under Hitler in Bavaria was palpably growing in strength and size, unquote. At the end of September of 1923, the German Chancellor declared a state of emergency and put Germany under military rule. Seeing the waning confidence of German workers in the Ruhr and Hitler's rise to power in the Bavarian region, the German Chancellor took decisive action to maintain control of the situation. Quote, on September of 1926, Chancellor Stresemann suspended 7 articles of the Weimar's constitution, himself declared a state of emergency. Germany had become a military dictatorship, no less, and by the choice and that of largely socialist cabinet. The country was divided into 7 military districts with a local military dictator over each. Simultaneously, President Ebert announced the end of the passive resistance in the Ruhr, unquote. However, it was clear by October that Bavaria was out of the hands of the central government of Berlin. Bavaria, where Hitler was active, showed no deference to Berlin or the Chancellor, setting the stage for more internal conflict. Quote, although Munich and the municipalities of Bavaria were suffering no more than the same economic rigors as anywhere else, it was evident that here was the most explosive mixture in Germany. New decrees were issued daily prohibiting public meetings and strikes, and there was no doubt that the 2 authoritarian friends, von Kerr and General von Lossow, were in full control. So confident were they indeed that they were calculating, ignoring instructions received from Berlin. Their posture even went to the lengths of refusing Berlin's order to ban Hitler's newspaper, the Volkscher Beobachter, on October 2nd, but nonetheless suspending it for 10 days from October 5th to publishing a treasonable article, unquote. Finally, in November of 1923, the German government took action to stabilize the currency. The German government set up the Reichsbank to issue a new currency, the Renton Mark, which would be backed by land and industrial goods, so a commodity-backed currency. The Renton Mark finally stabilized the German currency. Quote, As it was, the confidence trick worked. The Renton Mark, the stopgap designed to shift the 1923 harvest, became the weapon which held the field for the billion-mark note until the Reichsmark was brought in a year later. On the basis, said Bresciani-Turoni, of the simple fact that the new paper money had a different name from the old, the public thought it was something different from the paper mark. The new money was accepted despite the fact that it was unconvertible paper currency. It was held and not spent so rapidly, unquote. And the next month, in December, the food shortages of the summer finally began to recede. And after a month, the Renton Mark was introduced. Everyday Germans were able to feed themselves again. Quote, food, however, was beginning to appear again in the towns halfway through December. To the Renton Mark alone was this development due. In 1923, before November, the only increase in animals slaughtered for food had occurred in dogs, mainly used to supply a deficiency in pork. After stabilization, the consumption of every article of daily need, beer, pork, coffee, sugar, and tobacco, increased regularly, except dog meat. Unquote. Yikes. However, after a recovery in 1924, a whole new crisis hit Germany in 1925. Mass unemployment. The strengthened currency and subsiding hyperinflationary pressures once again brought German industry to its knees as several firms plunged into bankruptcy and unemployment soared. Quote, the picture in the first week of December 1925 presented the politician's nightmare of 1922, the approach of genuine, unhidden mass unemployment that the policy of inflation had so largely been designed to avoid. The mark stood steady. By February of 1926, the number of registered unemployed soared over 2 million, with depression reaching from Hamburg to Bavaria. The average number of registered unemployed stayed at over 2 million through 1926, otherwise a year of rationalization and of economic and industrial recovery. It was still at nearly 1.5 million in December, unquote. This was hugely demoralizing for Germany, which thought it had already been through the worst and was staging a recovery. And this shock brought increasing divergence between the fortunes of the middle and lower classes. With the new crisis, the tables were turned. The lower classes found themselves unemployed, and the middle classes did relatively well. Quote, by May of that year, the circumstances of doctors, lawyers, professors, and writers, and the like had radically changed. They were again able to live in circumstances appropriate to their cultural environment. Their fees were being paid, and their services were required in full measure. Only the legions of unemployable whose substance had been dissipated and the hundreds of thousands of workers for whom there was no work bore the outward scars of great inflation and spoilt the otherwise happy picture, unquote. But post-war Germany never fully recovered, and mass unemployment eventually allowed Hitler to rise to power. Hitler leveraged the mass unemployment to gain support for the Nazi Party and quickly rose to political power in the 1930s. Quote, to say that inflation caused Hitler, or by extension that a similar inflation elsewhere than in Weimar Germany could produce other right or left-wing dictatorships, is to wander into quagmires of irrelevant historical analogy. On the other hand, the vast unemployment of the early 30s gave Hitler the votes he needed. Just as the scale of that large unemployment was part of the economic progression originating in the excesses of the inflationary years, so the considerable successes of the Nazi Party immediately after stabilization and immediately before the recession were linked, paced the observations of the Consul General Clive with its advances in 1922 and 1923, unquote. The crisis Europe faces today and that we see in the U.S. is way more dangerous than a sovereign debt crisis. And guys, why do we learn history like this? Because those who do not know their history, as it is said, they are doomed to repeat it. And we can talk about why we stack silver and why we stack gold and the failure of the dollar and all of these things. But let's look to our past. Let's look to our history and learn and teach our young and teach our friends, teach those in our circle of influence so that we don't have to repeat and live through what the people of the past, these Germans of the past, and look, there's stories like this about Zimbabwe, I'm sure. There's stories like this about Venezuela. Let's not be so arrogant to think that it can't be us.